everyone, and welcome back to the Film Score Podcast. Today, my guest is Colin Stetson. You're probably familiar with Colin and his work for Hereditary, but not only does he have a lot of other great scores, he has a fairly big and extensive back catalog of solo work that is quite strange and unorthodox and heavily features his lead bass saxophone. But today we're talking about his score for the new Netflix film, Texas Chainsaw Massacre, which is a direct sequel to the 1974 original, and in some ways is a spiritual successor, musically, moving from Wayne Bell's almost pure noise and sound design score to something as equally unorthodox. And I know the film so far has been pretty divisive. Some people absolutely love it, and I have seen some people call it one of the worst movies they've ever seen. But no matter what your reservations may be, I highly recommend giving the score a listen. It's about as raw and brutal as film music gets. And I know that might not be up everyone's alley, but it's certainly worth a listen. Of course, you can find more about Colin on his website or on social media, and watch the film on Netflix, and hear his music anywhere digitally or on vinyl through Waxwork Records. And now if you're enjoying the show, please, of course, leave a rating, leave a review, send me an email and let me know. It's always nice hearing from people. Now, without anything further, sit back and I hope you enjoy. Colin, I'm so glad you could join me. How have you been?
I've been very well. Thanks for having me.
Excellent. I'm so glad you could join me. I've been a big fan of yours for a while, so having the opportunity is really exciting.
Thank you so much. That's great.
Yeah, we'll jump into talking about your new film, the upcoming Texas Chainsaw Massacre. But first, and much more importantly, I noticed that you actually were born and raised in Ann Arbor, and I actually lived there for 7 years too.
Really? You went to school?
Yeah. Yeah, I went there for, I grew up in Southeast Michigan, but I went there for undergrad and grad school as well.
Excellent. I did my undergrad there as well. I spent the first 22 years of life there, and great town. Very different town today than it was. I left in 98, I think. Yeah, 98. Very different town, but I think the same could be said for any college town.
Right. Yeah. Anywhere after 20, 25 years.
Yeah. When I left, there still were the remnants of like the old punk rock era, and there still were these spaces, these performance spaces that still got kind of like edgy, noisy sort of local stuff going on, and tons. Maybe by the time I left, there weren't tons of house parties, but that was just the culture when I was growing up, all through high school, playing these tiny, just absolute fire hazard death traps of basement parties where just kids were just crammed into them. I remember there was this one that was basically no more than a hallway with a tiny stairwell up at one end, where the stage was on the long end, and it really was, barely 3 feet deep. The drummer, almost didn't fit on there, and the whole band was just like in a line, and the rest of the audience was in a pit that couldn't have been 10 feet deep, and then and just stretched out wide like that. And we had enormous sweaty fun for a lot of years, all the way through college and stuff. So it was a great place to cut one's teeth, musically speaking. We just got to play.
That's awesome, and yeah, I haven't gone to house parties there in a while, but that unless you really looked, you couldn't really find anything like that.
Yeah, nor have I. I haven't been frequenting the Ann Arbor college house parties scene recently.
But so what was? And I didn't even intend to get on this track, but what was that like, cutting your teeth on a really tiny, intimate DIY scene like that?
We were in music school, and of course, the vast majority of us were all studying classically at the time, but we were also branching out. We were learning about everything. We were learning about just music from all over the world, and constantly listening. And if we weren't at school, we were together listening to music, or in rehearsal, writing and rehearsing new music. And there wasn't any sense of a restriction in terms of parameters of genre or style or anything like that. It was really just everybody was doing as much as they possibly could. Just this glut of absorbing everything that we could in our ears, and then exhausting ourselves with involving our efforts in industry, like on our instruments, like growing through them in all this different music. And so through college, like I think by the end of it, I was in, this is on top of the ensembles and things that you're in university, but there were, I think, 5 or 6 different bands that I was a member of, and we were in all those groups. Many of them shared the same different configurations of players, because we were all, and one of them could be something really abstract, hard-hitting and noisy, and then another could be much more, like for a stretch we were doing, we had this very traditional Irish thing going on that was just loads of fun. But it was just like that. Whatever we wanted to do, we simply did it, and then and we had cultivated relationships with all the club owners and stuff around town and around the area. And so we played. We were gigging most nights of the week, and that kind of thing, I think, is probably, I mean, I can't say either way because I don't have a whole lot of contact with younger musicians, but it seemed like that was something certainly not unique to that time, because it was something that, talking to older players, it was something that they all got up to, it probably in a much bigger way for longer after school and through their 20s. But for us, it definitely, looking back, it's just like this very precious time of being able, fortunate enough to have, not only the time to devote to all of that kind of communal searching and exploration, but to do it with, to have access to these brilliant players and minds, and many of whom, probably most of whom, I'm still count amongst my best friends and collaborators even now. So it was a very good stretch of upbringing there.
That's awesome. And it sounds like that has really carried through, just because of how open you are and how naturally it seems that you have experimentation, not just with sound, but with the use of your instruments. I mean, you listen to your score for like the Texas Chainsaw Massacre, Hereditary, or going back to your earlier work, like solo works, and there's just a lot of like weird, unorthodox shit in there that sounds really good.
TCM is about as weird and unorthodox shit as I could get. I was doing an email interview earlier this week, and somebody, one of the questions was, tell me about your use of chainsaws and other machines in this score. And I read it at first, and I just glanced over it, and then I went back to it, and I went, no, that's a real question. He actually thinks from listening to this that I recorded machines, and that's kind of cool. The fact of it is that the score, I could list the sound sources that I used to make that whole score, and most of them are just sitting behind me right now. There's a contrabass saxophone called a tubax, a pile of about 25 antique Tibetan singing bowls, my Yamaha upright piano downstairs, and then a few other saxophones and woodwinds, and then with a little bit of an old Junker viola that I have. But that's basically it. The point of it, I mean, I adore the search, and I love finding my way to a sound, to a kind of character through all these backdoor avenues. If you want to make it feel like it's this kind of living, breathing machine with, all the, just this kind of rusty gears and like old dried blood flaking off, what's the fun in trying to record the actual machine, coming through it through a more it's still not conventional, but through conventional instrumentation, and then morphing, just twisting and stretching and manipulating those sounds to get to a place where they truly don't resemble where they came from whatsoever, and then they can kind of hearken up in the listener's experience. Like, you're going to then contextualize it however it is that you contextualize it, based on your own experience, rather than everybody looking at a thing and going, that's a chainsaw, or that's a violin, or that's a piano. Like, obscuring the source of the sound makes it so that it can just be, well, in my mind, it can simply be a vehicle for the affectation of mood, of experience, and it can then affect one's state of mind and one's emotional senses. I love that kind of thing, and this one I went definitely in the context of everything that I've done, and I always do a lot of like a fair amount of manipulation when it comes to building scores, but this one went much, much further to the degree that there is almost nothing that happens musically that isn't in some way just wrenched from its original form. And then the idea, I had thought about this as I was kind of wrapping things up and going through mixes, like the idea of ever performing something like this, not because it's so abstract or improvised or something, because it really isn't. Like these things are not, like nothing is improvised. Every single bit in there, and some of them are like I work really densely, and some of these sessions are they're just colossal. They go on for forever. They're just depths of tracks, but it's all entirely organized and all entirely intentional. And so the composition of it is something that could be codified, but how would you? Everything would have to be. You'd have to find your way back to some, and this I guess could be kind of fun to then approximate the instrumentation that it would take to now bring to life this thing that is no longer really of an instrumentation because it's been twisted so much into these other forms. So there's a longer, more tangential answer to your question, but yeah.
With that, I guess taking a lot of largely conventional instruments and then morphing them into almost unrecognizable forms. Do you think there really becomes at that point, a difference between noise and music, or does it then reach a point where it's kind of indistinguishable?
Not to get like all, I don't really believe in a distinction. I don't really believe in a distinction between noise and music. And I know that, we can sometimes when we're talking about things, we use the term noise and we use the term music, and I do the same thing. But for practical purposes, I don't think of a distinction, because music is any sound, any organization of sound that presented as such elicits an emotional response from, assuming like we're making music for people, a person. In that case, any sound, any quote unquote noise is music if it is presented as such and eliciting an emotional response from its listener. And what exactly was your question?
Well, that was exactly it.
Okay.
Whether there's a delineation between the two, because some of your scores, your solo work, when you're looking at it from a more conventional mindset, it can lead people to say, "Oh, this is just noise." But like for someone like me who's more open to that, it doesn't. It's funny you saying an emotional reaction from a human. I was listening to your first album earlier, just on my speakers. And it got an emotional reaction from my cat, too. Like, she hated it.
Which one is this? The first solo record?
Yeah, your first solo record.
Oh, okay. Yeah. No, yeah, cats hate that one. It's terrible. It's a real flop.
But it's interesting mentioning the reaction, the noise element, because I think kind of surprisingly, there are quite a few moments in the film and in the score where you're eliciting a much more tender reaction to. They tend to be a bit more fleeting or briefer, but like there are moments where you're humanizing Leatherface, and it's something that is, it's kind of surprising and unexpected.
A little bit. Well, ultimately, I'm working with the director. I'm working with the entire production. There are moves made to, well, this movie was not simply just a slasher bit, in that there were some moments like Lila's flashback when she's kind of dealing with the gun in the garage for that first time, where we need something there that adequately encapsulates and projects her inner world in that moment, and that's where the biggest challenge comes for me for something like this, because I don't believe in what I've seen a million times, but I don't believe in doing it, where you've crafted something sonically, aesthetically, that has a certain character to it, and a certain character that really is completely detached and divorced from a like we were talking about before, from having its roots in recognizable conventional sound source and idiom. And then now that you've got a moment which is playing not as horror, not as suspense, and not as some grotesquerie, you've got a moment of real human emotion, and all of a sudden the fucking strings come out. And for some reason, we've just made that move that's how we as human beings, like, those are the emoters, those are the vehicles of our inner world. And I despise the move. I mean, if you're working in the context of something like, say one of my scores, Color Out of Space, I used a lot of strings in that score, and for a more heartfelt moment, string use was completely on the table because it was part of the overall aesthetic. But for something like this, nothing could be further from accessible for me. So it was finding a way to extract kinds of real heartfelt emotion from an instrumentation and a modified instrumentation that still felt part and parcel to the overall score, to the overall aesthetic. And so that was the bigger challenge, and actually a lot of fun. And so what ends up coming through there is something like that first Lila scene where you have piano. There is a bit. Well, now I'm my foot in my mouth about the strings thing, because there is like there's me on a very, very janky viola that's been completely stretched and dropped on the ground a number of times. But so yeah, piano, old viola, and a bunch of Tibetan singing bowls, and kind of the same thing for all of them. And this is where the fun for me starts, because there's puzzles, and you look at the instrument of the piano, and you go there and you play it, and you go, okay, I wonder if I play this speed and I play these notes and I get these harmonies and these overtones, and I mic it here in this way with these mics, then I take that. I can see that once I take that, I'm going to stretch it, not too much, just a little bit, and then I'm going to drop it maybe 2 octaves, and then I'm going to EQ it, such and such, compress, EQ, compress. When I'm playing it, I can think of through those steps, and so that then I just come upstairs, I mix through, and I get it to where it was in my head before I started the process. And the more you kind of weave your way through these processes, the more they become part of the instrument, so that you're hearing the end result when you're playing the initial offering, and which goes for the more brutal moments as well. Like, I think today we just dropped the first track from that record, which is my favorite track in the whole movie, this Every Last One, which is just this, my favorite kind of brutal, full-on massacre tune. And it's like a fucking sludge metal. It's a dirge. It's awesome. And it was the most fun that I had on the score. It was so freeing to just fucking for so long. And when the lead finally comes in, this screaming refrain, it's a turkey call. It's a little diaphragm. Just kind of looks like a little piece of rubber you put on top of the roof of your mouth, and then you blow through it and manipulate your mouth in certain ways. And that melody is just turkey calling, but played in a certain way, and then pulled and stretched and beefed, and then it becomes this horrible screeching anthem for a chainsaw that's ripping through folks. I love that part of it, the part that we're finding our way to where we can see the instrument as being more than the thing that's right in front of you. This thing can sound endless amounts of ways. This is the source. This creates an acoustic, a variety and breadth of sound acoustically, and there's a lot of different ways, conventionally and unconventionally, to use this. But then once you've got that captured, then you can take it in so many other directions. And knowing those, and experimenting with those paths means that later on you have all of that experimentation still in your repertoire, and it can be utilized again and again and again, and varied upon. So that's what it's all about for me.
Calling it a fucking sludge metal dirge is like so spot on. And it's weird because I describe music like that as, it is like horrible and grating, but in a really a good way, which I think is like hard to internalize sometimes. But hearing that kind of brutality musically, even stripped away from the film itself, is really exciting and visceral and primal. And having that opportunity to kind of be unleashed must be great. Was that kind of the experience in the film, that you had almost a carte blanche to see where you could take it, or were there times where you were pulled back?
No, I wasn't. And that's why this thing is gnarly. They never... there were a couple of moments that later on, after screenings of the film, ended up being changed from something that originally was conceived of musically as being much more dark, and then there were moments of more, what we were talking about, kind of heartfelt humanity, for lack of a better terminology. There were moments like that were kind of musically added, expanded to give a little bit more levity to it. But otherwise, no. I was told very distinctly in the beginning of the process that they were making a true sequel to what we imagined, to the original, and keeping in line with the spirit of that one. We're dealing with something that was very groundbreaking, abstract, and genre bending especially in its time, and paved the way for people like me to do more things, to have a much greater breadth of possibility now with our own work. But yeah, I was told, I think verbatim, go nonlinear. It was something like, go far out, go nonlinear, go Chainsaw Massacre. That's very liberating, and it's also pretty rare, I think, for productions to really give composers carte blanche and to not be afraid of sticking to aesthetic norms. Most of what you hear sounds very similar to most of what you hear for a reason. Mm-hmm. It's less and less, I think, these days, because more and more, as composers, we're given more freedom to explore and to experiment and to innovate. But for a long time, it seemed to me that there was and I mean, there still certainly is, like with the huge productions, you've got this mammoth amounts of money, and they're really kind of being designed as commodities in this way, so they have to conform to a certain aesthetic scripture, I suppose, or script. But more and more, I think we're, as composers, getting this kind of freedom to make things truly unique, and you can see it, happening all over the place. People are really making some beautiful and like unique work come out of these years, and it's very, I find it very exciting. But yeah, bringing it back to TCM here, I was always it was like being the perfect kind of kid and mad scientist, that you always want to be on these jobs, where I would just come up to my studio in the morning, and then I would have had some idea in the middle of the night, and wondering, I wonder if that's going to be how I come to that sound for that moment. Like, that beat really needs something, and I wonder if that's the beat. And I come up here, and then I take, the first thing, I don't have it around, so I can't show it, but the first thing I did, for one of the things that people probably think is like saws scraping metal throughout the course of it, is a bass saxophone, my old bass saxophone, like my 110-year-old instrument, with a Tibetan bowl taped onto the bell this way, sealed, and then played massively so that the seal of this against the bell vibrates and lets only air out as you push it through. And then what happens is a screeching, scraping howl that you can control in musical ways. So that's why it still has pitch, it still has shape, it's still musically, in the sense of conventional music, it still plays harmonically with its context. That's one of the kinds of things that comes out of having carte blanche to experiment and to explore that, and so many other things. So
well, I love the ingenuity and experimentation behind creating those sounds. Like, I've read that the iconic flashbulb sound from the original film was really just them taking like two wires and scraping them together, but it creates something that sounds completely unrecognizable from that.
Oh yeah.
But going back to getting that freedom, obviously you've worked in films of all sorts of genres, but a lot of your recent ones, and the ones I think you're most well known for, are all horror. And from my experience as a listener and as talking to composers, it seems like horror really gives the most freedom to composers. Is that something that you've experienced, and the reason why it seems like in recent years you've been drawn to working on horror projects?
No, I have heard that people think that horror affords more freedom musically. I think that it's more that right now there's a shit ton of horror being made. They're just like studios are just absolutely going hog wild for horror scripts and making these projects. So there's a ton of it out there, and the studios they're much more open within that genre to exploration. No reason why you can't. I mean, there have been so many different unconventional and like truly like new and unique moments in drama and in other genres of film, and so there's nothing specific to the genre that gives it more freedom or less. I really just think that it's a moment in time in the industry and in a sentiment amongst the people who are making these decisions. But for my own part, I think that early on, I think I've always been tapped. You know, I've been scoring films since I think when I did Blue Caprice with Alexander Moores was something around 2010 or so, something right around there. And you know, he knew me from my solo music, and he thought that because of that music and a kind of tension, suspense, and like an setting sort of nature to a lot of it by his ears, that I would be a good fit for his film. And I think a lot of people have approached me in that way because when you make, I mean, I like to make people uncomfortable in music, and I always have with the solo music, not in order to make them uncomfortable and keep them uncomfortable, although sometimes that's necessary, but in order to get them off, to put them off their balance, in order to make them vulnerable, in order to then rope them into something maybe a layer deeper in terms of their attention. And so if I mix my breathing very, very high and pan it out to the sides, and you're listening to one of a track that I specifically really want you to hone in on a certain aspect of it, maybe I'll use that as a means of capturing your attention and making you feel a kind of visceral, innate and ancestral panic. Like we'll just do that to grab your attention, and now I have you, and I can take you away with something else, some other part of it that you more readily want to attach yourself to, because that's propulsion, and that's something that you know, that the music is going to take you into a place that maybe will explore something now that you're open to it. Convention, I think, in a lot of ways can be not necessarily so, but can be something that limits and kind of deadens the emotional response, because we all have autopilots, because we have a sense of familiarity, and if something's too familiar, certain aspects of our attention just shut off, and we just let them play out again as though they already played out. All that to say, I like employing certain things that are usually thought of as scoring to something like horror or suspense and thrillers. So I've done more horror and suspense and thrillers, but I also have done other things. And honestly, everything is, you can make an unconventional score, the one that evokes every necessary emotion for any kind of film with any kind of instrumentation. I don't think that it's in any way specific to the genre, and I really love being able to do a lot of different things. I know that I'm known for horror most, and I'm usually tapped for that, but I think that mostly has to do with Hereditary, because that film was so much in the greater body of my work. That was the biggest splash that I've been a part of. And certainly has had the most legs as a score beyond the film of anything I've done. So although I never really saw it as a horror film, you know, I always talked with Ari early on about that one being, it's like I think I'm going to be bastardizing what he said, but like a dysfunctional family drama couched in the vessel of a horror film. It's more the splintering relationships of this family that is suffering after a gruesome loss, and so I played to that. I don't really think of Hereditary, especially the score, as being in any way a conventional horror score. I find it much more of a drama.
Interesting. I mean, I think part of that goes to what you were saying earlier about convention. People like to box things in the ways that are easiest for them. And when you put it like that, hell, I think it makes a lot of sense. But I'll be honest, Colin, I could keep you here and listen to you talk
yeah.
all afternoon, but I'll save you from that. I'll let you go.
All right, man.
I really, really appreciate you joining me. It was great chatting with you today.
You too. Thanks for having me.